Let's have a look at adding and subtracting integers. In the last video, we learned that integers are all whole numbers, and their opposites. They're opposites. If you don't know what opposites means, go ahead and check out my opposites video in the description below. And if you don't know what an integer is and you need a little bit more clarification, you can check out that video as well. But when we're talking about adding integers, we have two types of integers. We have positive integers, which I can depict with a yellow circle, and we have negative integers, which I can depict with a red circle. So all my red circles or my counters are going to represent positive 1. And then my red is going to represent negative 1. So if you're in my class, we use these red and yellow counters to show. And whenever I have a red and a yellow counter next to each other, a positive and a negative, it creates something called a zero pair. So these two together, negative 1, positive 1 together, are going to cancel each other out. They're going to make something called a zero pair. Because if I have 1 and I take away 1, I have nothing. If I have negative 1 and I add 1, I get 0. So these are going to cancel each other out and become a zero pair. So there's 3 ways to solve an addition problem with integers. One of them is with these red and yellow counters. The second way is to draw out the counters. So if I was given the problem 2 plus negative 3, I would draw out 2 positives to represent positive 2, and I'm using yellow because that's positive, and 3 negatives, 1, 2, 3 negatives. Alright, so when I see the red and the yellow next to each other, I know that that's called a zero pair. 0 means nothing, which means every time I see a zero pair, I can cross it out because it's canceled out. I see 2 zero pairs, and all I'm left with is this 1 red. 1 red is the same thing as saying negative 1. So 2 plus negative 3 is going to equal negative 1. Let's try another example. I have negative 4 plus negative 2. So I'm going to draw out 1, 2, 3, 4 red circles because those are my negatives. And then negative 2, 2 red circles. Now, my zero pair is a positive and a negative next to each other. I'm not seeing that anywhere because I don't have any positives. All I have is negatives, which means nothing's going to cancel out. So all I have to do is see how many red counters I have here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So what I'm left over with is negative 6. So negative 4 plus negative 2 is equal to negative 6. Now, the third way to solve adding integers problems, you may be dealing with larger integers like negative 32 plus 40. So we have some rules to go along with this. So rule number 1 is that when you add a number with its opposite, you're always going to get 0. This is because I'm going to have an equal amount of positive and an equal amount of negatives, and they're going to all cancel out to be 0 pairs. So for example, I'd have 3 plus, the opposite of positive 3 is negative 3. So 3 plus negative 3 is going to be 0. Because if I have 3 positives, 1, 2, 3, and 3 negatives, 1, 2, 3, they're all 0 pairs, so they're all going to be able to be canceled out. Okay? This works either way. If I have negative 100 plus the opposite of negative 100, which is positive 100. That means I would have 100 yellows, 100 reds, and they would all cancel out to get 0. That's rule number 1. Let's look at rule number 2. Rule number 2 says, when adding a positive and a negative number, first take the difference and keep the sign of the number with the greater absolute value. So let's break this rule down a little bit. So it says if you're adding a number with positive and negative, that means 2 numbers of different signs. First thing we're going to do is take the difference. Now, difference, as many of you know, is the answer to a subtraction problem. So when it says difference, that means we're going to subtract the 2 numbers, or we're going to subtract the 2 absolute values. So let's look at 10 plus negative 6. Okay, so we're going to take the difference between 10 and 6. So over here off to the side, I'm going to do 10 minus 6, which is 4. So I know my answer is going to be 4. And then I have to figure out if I have more positives or more negatives to decide if this is going to be positive 4 or negative 4. So if I drew this out, I would have 10 positives. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And 6 negatives. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. After I canceled out all the zero pairs, or even just looking at it, I can tell that I have more positives. So my answer is going to be positive 4. Let's try a different one. We'll do negative 40 plus positive 30. First thing I want to do is take the difference. That means subtract. So I'm going to take the difference between 40 and 30, which is going to be 10. And I have to decide if this is positive or negative 10. I have 40 negative and 30 positive. So I definitely have more negatives in this scenario, and if I were to draw it out, I would be left with all red circles, so my answer is negative 10. So the third rule of adding with integers is that when you're adding numbers with the same sign, you keep the sign of the originals. All you got to do is add them together. So if we're working with positive numbers, it's very straightforward. 4 plus 5. We all know that 4 plus 5 is 9. And since they were both positive to begin with, we know my answer has to be positive. But let's take a look at negative 4 plus negative 5. Just like up here in my first example, when I did a negative plus a negative, there's no zero pairs because there's no positives. So I don't have to cross anything out. I just have to count it all up, which is 4 plus 5, and keep the sign of the originals. They were negative to start with, so they're going to be negative to end. I always like to sum it up with this little key phrase right here, which is same signs add, different signs subtract. That just means if I have a positive plus a positive, I'm going to add them, keep the same sign. If I have a negative plus a negative, add them, keep the negative. And different signs, I'll take the difference, subtract, and keep the sign of the number with the greater absolute value.